you for all of you who are here now. What I'm here to go over is the economic contributions of aquaculture in Maine, as is obviously shown on the screen in front of you. What I really want to touch on is how aquaculture contributes to Maine's economy, how it includes over 400 different sectors, and to really outline where it fits in Maine and why it's the majority of seafood produced in Maine after lobster. I really want to show too, not only the numbers of aquaculture, but really what it offers to people and the opportunities it provides for entrepreneurship, career growth, for people of all ages and backgrounds. And last, what I really want to tie in here through all of this work is to show why aquaculture matters and why it matters to support aquaculture for the state and to show why it does matter for Maine. And of course, I'm talking about Maine here specifically, but a lot of what I'm saying here is broadly applicable across different states in the US and the nation as a whole. There we go. So, why did we want to work on this? Well, we really want to figure out what's going on. We see aquaculture is growing, we hear it's growing, but we don't really know exactly where, we don't know how. We know some of the ideas of why, but we don't know all this. So we're really trying to capture through this work was what does aquaculture look like in Maine, and what does that growth actually look like? How much contribution is there to the state's economy? Where is it occurring? How is it occurring? And to really compare this to a benchmark that we had set in 2014, which is a study I'll mention in just a second. So for this work, what we wanted to do was focus on the year was 2023. So what we did was focus on a sector-wide survey. And the reason we did that is a lot of people with this economic contribution, or as it's often called, economic impact work, what we wanted to do was really work from the ground level up, from the farm up, to get better, more detailed data. So we went with the farm level survey method. This is by some considered to be the gold standard when it comes to economic contribution and impact work. The idea being that rather than work from the top down, say some publicly available tax information or Bureau of Labor and Statistics, rather than work from that data backwards, we're working from the farms up. So with that, not only do we get data on revenue and employment, but we get a lot of data on the actual expenses and revenues that are occurring on the farm. So it really helps us paint a more thorough, detailed picture of what's happening from the farm throughout the rest of the economy in the state as a whole. It's also really complicated with aquaculture because up until more recently, it hasn't really fit very well into a lot of those different publicly available databases. So it was really hard to glean information, and that's part of what makes it really difficult to compare to as well. But this is considered, again, the gold standard. So what we did, I'll detail more in a second, but was a sector-wide survey. We then ran all the data from that through IMPLAN, which is a statistical modeling software that specifically focuses on economic contributions, and it's typically the most, say, the leading product used in that in this economic contribution sphere. The outputs from this project were to create a report, which ended up actually being two separate reports, one on the economic contribution and one on a full technical detailed report from the survey, capturing more of the, not as much the economic contribution numbers, but the who, the what, and the why. And on the bottom is all the partners we had on this project. So they're all named in the title slides. It was myself, Christian Braden, again, the project manager at the Maine Aquaculture Association, and Sebastian Bell, our executive director from the Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center. We had doctors Ann Langston Knoll and Chris Davis. We worked with Atlantic Corporation and a number of their employees and staff. Texas A&M, we worked with Dr. Ganesh Kumar on the economic contribution work, and then I'm sorry, Texas A&M was Dr. Shraddha Hegde, who's considered really the national expert on economic contribution. And then Mississippi State, we worked with Dr. Ganesh Kumar as well. So to talk a bit more on the economics here and the methods, this economic contribution work was focused on IMPLAN, which, as I mentioned, is the leading software for economic impact or economic contribution work. That work was led by Dr. Shraddha Hegde. She's considered really the national expert in this from the aquaculture perspective. She's published a lot on state, regional, and national impacts and contributions of aquaculture. She very kindly, along with Dr. Kumar, dedicated their work pro bono to this project to make sure that it was done and that it was done correctly. With that, and myself and Dr. Kumar working with Shraddha on that, we use the industry impact analysis method, which I won't bore you all with the details now. But what was really cool about this was that this is a new method to really improve the accuracy of economic contribution work or industry impact. And because, as I mentioned before, aquaculture doesn't really fit into any specific categories within the software because the software aligns with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we had to sort of create our own. So in order to do that, we use this industry impact analysis, which lets us work with the data we have to customize the software to make it really fit into the category correctly. So, and in fact, part of the reason we had to redo some of the study, most of the study actually, was because it was in the incorrect category first. So I'm happy to talk about anyone with that later after this as well. So what we did with this industry impact analysis was teach the software how to use aquaculture correctly. And this was the first time this was done for aquaculture in the US. So this is really a novel application of this process as well that's been very, very seldom used so far, more so in agriculture typically, but we're the first to use it in the aquaculture sense, as far as we know around the world even. So it's an exciting growth there as well. And this work was funded mostly through NOAA and Maine Sea Grant, the Maine Aquaculture Hub, with the funding number there. We had additional support through the Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center and Focus Maine. So the survey itself, we had about 164 responses. You may be wondering, where did that come from? That's a pretty big number for Maine. We sent it to all lease and LPA holders. So we went to DMR and worked with them to get all of the publicly available information on everyone who holds leases and LPAs in the state. We had 164 responses, which is about a 46% response rate. That may sound low to some of you, and to others, myself included, that may sound very high. 46% as a response rate for this type of financial-based work is extremely high. Typically, a response rate in the 20s is considered pretty good. So this is a really, frankly, exceptional response rate, especially when we factor in the total coverage that it allowed. It's really difficult, we learned, and was actually confirmed through this study, to figure out exactly how many people are operating in Maine because of the leasing system. Some people are under different names, and in the LPAs as well. Sometimes you have multiple people working together holding LPAs. So it's pretty challenging to get an exact number. But this is, after all of our best calculations, what we did. And you may be wondering, how accurate is the sample? Well, after we factored in how much our coverage was and extrapolated the full sample size, and I truly could not believe this, our accuracy was in 3.5% of DMR's data. So this is a highly representative sample, higher than I ever really could have dreamt of having achieved through this project. And what did we ask people in this online survey done through Qualtrics? We asked them about revenues, expenses, employment, and demographics. So this is where I said it gives us a really rich, robust data set to not only explore how aquaculture ripples throughout the whole economy, but also what it means to the people within Maine on a more individual basis. So I mentioned this 2014 benchmark. This is the Maine Aquaculture Economic Impact Report. Some of you who are really in the weeds about this type of work probably recognize this. This was led by the University of Maine Aquaculture Research Institute, along with the Maine Aquaculture Innovation Center and the Maine Aquaculture Association. Its data was based in 2014. It was published in 2017, and it interviewed 71 businesses. So this was our baseline against which we were comparing. What this study found, again, in the January of 2017 is when it was published, so 2014 data, $130 million were contributed to the total economy in Maine. A little over 1,000 jobs, those are both full-time and part-time jobs, were then contributed to the Maine economy at large. So that is to say, aquaculture in 2014 in Maine contributed about $138 million to the state economy and a little over 1,000 full and part-time jobs. So how does it grow from there? Our work, and here's a cover from it, was based in 2023. And quick note on that, you may be wondering, it's 2026, what happened there? Well, we had to wait for 2023 to finish, in order to start working with people to collect a full data set from 2023. We then ran into some issues. As I mentioned, we had to redo the entirety of the economic contribution portion of the study, which I'm glad to detail with anybody offline after this as well. Lessons learned are important in all this type of work. And the good news is, as I mentioned, we're using a new innovative process that's never been used before to estimate all this work. So that's how we ended up in 2026 publishing all of this, especially given the pro bono work done by doctors Shraddha Hegde and Ganesh Kumar. So 2023, 164 businesses surveyed. That's nearly over double what we saw in the previous one, which may give you some indications about some growth that we've seen with pretty similar response rates. What did we see overall? And don't worry, this is not the entirety of the webinar right here. It goes into much more detail. We saw a little over $200 million contributed to Maine's economy at large, and a little over 1,700 jobs contributed to the economy. So what does this look like? These are the highlights. And how does it compare? Because you may very well have forgotten those numbers already. Well, we have them pulled together right here. So this is showing the growth of Maine aquaculture at a very, very high level and shows both the direct industry contribution, which is exactly what the industry is spending and making, and then the total impact, which is that ripple effect, that multiplier throughout the whole economy. I'll go into that more in just a second. But it shows this growth from about 137 million to 208 million, which is pretty notable over the course of 9 years. What's even more notable is that both of these occurred in a year in which finfish were on a higher fallowing cycle. So a planned cycle in which finfish aren't in a high production. So that happens every 3 years. Both of these happen to occur in a 3-year low. So that, for consistency's sake, is good. However, what it also doesn't show is a good reflection of what we actually are seeing in aquaculture. So in Maine, what we probably see here, what we see here right now is about a 5 to 6% growth from 2014 to 2023 per year. So between 2014 and 2023, on average, we had a 5 to 6% growth based on this data. However, we also know that on top of it being a low year for finfish and fallowing, there was also a really large unexpected loss in 2023, which had a really big toll on the finfish sector. So that total impact we see in 2023 could very well be over 250 million in a more average year. So this, what we see in terms of growth, is a very conservative estimate. And 5 to 6% reflects that. If we were to look more at that typical year without that loss, we'd probably see more like 8 to 9%. And I'll get into that a little more in a second when we look at a bigger breakdown. But you may be asking, what is this direct to indirect? And just to run you through that really quickly, this is from Implan, again, that software. And what they show is, so that direct effect is that red circle. So these are things that you can measure, like wages, production. So that's the money being spent by aquaculture businesses directly. That's a direct effect. The indirect effect is the next level, and that's things like the wages paid to employees or purchasing of goods and services. So that could be people buying food at the corner store when they're on the job. That could be people working with local marinas to service their engines or moorings, supply chains, business taxes, so on and so forth. And then the induced impacts are household purchases. So that's things for people who are now living there because of aquaculture. Local and import purchases, and also additional wages paid on top of that, and household taxes. So these are the three levels that we see: the direct, the indirect, and the induced. These three things bring you the total impact of aquaculture, the total contribution. And what this is asking is that direct effect. How much additional economic activity does $1 in the sector create? Well, what we found was overall, about $1 spent by the Maine aquaculture sector contributed almost an additional dollar to the state's economy. That's pretty significant. So that's nearly a doubling of every dollar spent in Maine aquaculture going into the Maine's economy at large. And as you can see, these things all add up. So you have in these top bars here, that lighter tealish color is the direct, adding then the indirect and induced to get you the total. So uh, what we see here really is all the different impacts. And what I mentioned earlier too is that when we really looked at this on a granular level, what was mind-blowing about this was that when you look at where aquaculture reaches throughout the state, it touches over 400 different sectors. Not 400 different businesses. Aquaculture works with over 400 different sectors across the state. So that's how you see this really big impact statewide. What we also saw, and is not detailed in the previous study as much in this level, is that shellfish tripled over this time frame. So shellfish and seed sales directly more than tripled from 2014. So that's where the vast majority of this growth is coming from in this 9-year span. Finfish did grow as well, but as I mentioned again, with the lower fallow year, but especially with the really big unexpected loss that was taken, that had some serious impacts. That being said, finfish, despite being really far down, is the second most valuable fishery in the state after lobster by a long shot. And finfish, while it was produced of, I believe, was 9 different species, in this, its production is led by salmon. So that's something that we easily overlook, but it's to show that that finfish sector is the second most valuable fishery in the state, again, by a pretty significant amount. Um, but it's not just the total contribution. People are probably wondering, well, what does that look like in terms of who's working in the sector? Well, what we saw was that the majority of the jobs come from shellfish and seed. So most of these jobs are, and these are part-time and full-time jobs, although the majority of them, by a fair margin, are full-time jobs, are in the shellfish sector. So what we see there is a ton of really small family-run businesses, and I'll go into that more in a second as well. And that's what we see really across the entire sector is really small family-run businesses. And so here's what we see overall, a little over 1,700 total jobs supported, and about 1,200 of those jobs are directly in aquaculture. So that's saying there are about 1,200 jobs in aquaculture in the state that then support about another 500 jobs. So it's about a 1.35 multiplier, or roughly, every 3 aquaculture jobs supports somewhat of an additional job in Maine. So that means for perhaps, and this could make sense, if you think about, let's say, around the Damariscotta area, for each 3 new employees, that could mean another person working at probably the local deli making sandwiches for oyster farmers or whatever it may be. These are very real impacts you see on a ground level, granular level. So to compare this more directly, what did we see from 2014 to 2023? In terms of employment, the total impact is about a 60% growth. And that probably could be a little bit higher as well. And so that like 5 to 6% a year is again good, but it's considered pretty slow. And I say that because it's easy to think that aquaculture is growing really quickly in Maine, but given the early stage that it's in this whole sector maturity cycle, 5 to even 10% growth is frankly pretty slow. It's great, of course, to have that growth, especially this is through the years of COVID too. Really tough time to factor into these things, but it's still slow growth. However, if we look at some of those other estimates that looked at more like 8 to 9%, or maybe even a little above 10, that's closer to an ideal stage for an early stage sector like this. That's more like 10 to 20%. It's probably a bit more of a healthier level. So again, this is one of those areas that is seeing a lot of growth, but comparatively for where it is, it's still a really slow growth within the sector. And it's done very intentionally and sustainably. And just based on a lot of parameters right now, the growth's happening. It is slowly. So something I want to mention, I mentioned already to really highlight where aquaculture fits in the state. We have about 106 million in direct impact. And again, this could be pretty significantly higher in a more average year, especially for finfish. And what we found is after running some calculations, that this equates to about a little over 2/3 or 69% of the value of all Maine seafood after lobster. So lobster is $528 million of seafood, sorry, of value. And we're looking at 105 million for aquaculture as a whole. And finfish alone in that was 50 some odd million in this, which again could be pretty significantly higher in a given year. Followed then by either third following finfish would either typically be aquacultured oysters or soft shell clams, depending on the year, they're pretty close. And that's usually around 20-ish million as of right now, at least. And so you're looking at 528 million for lobster, finfish in the 50 to 100 million range, possibly even higher. And then oyster, aquaculture, or wild soft shell clam around 20 million. So it's a pretty significant second place. And when we look at aquaculture as a whole, especially with oysters being potentially the third most valuable species in the state, we see this is pretty significant. So once we remove lobster, this is the picture of fisheries in Maine, including aquaculture as a fishery. Over two-thirds of all value of seafood in Maine after lobster is coming from aquaculture. That's led again by finfish, followed by oysters, and then mussels, and then a variety of other species, including scallops, urchins, and many other things. So this was something that was really fascinating for us to learn. We hadn't really heard, and frankly, shocked me. I did not know this until I was running the numbers and all of this. But I want to paint more than just the piece of the pie here. What I want to talk about is some of these iconic Maine seafoods. So as I just mentioned, there are some products here. Some are wild, some are raised in Maine, aquaculture. And as I just said, the third most valuable species, so again, lobster, then finfish, which is led by salmon, you're looking at either soft shell clams or aquaculture raised oysters. That's the third most valuable species in the state. And then we look at other iconic species like mussels, 89% of Maine mussels come from aquaculture. And I just attended a very interesting webinar the other day from the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry on agritourism. And what they were discussing was that the number one reason people come to Maine is for the food. And they want to come here for, of course, in the agritourism sense, experiences, which is where things like the Oyster Trail have a really big impact. That's not even accounted for in all this work here. And that's another thing to consider as well. Were there other things like research and grants and tourism that are not necessarily accounted for in this work? This work is looking much more directly at aquaculture. And while it may capture some of that, there's still a lot more that is being brought into the state through aquaculture that is not mentioned in these contributions here. But when we look at these iconic Maine seafoods, these are the reason people come to Maine. Lobster, of course. Maine lobster is iconic. But after that, you're looking at things like salmon and then other finfish species as well. We have a lot of trout, clownfish, several species of trout, and several other types of fish that are really in the up and coming as well. And then you think about these more historically iconic Maine species in recent memory, at least, things like mussels, scallops, oysters, and these are being primarily raised. And I should put the number on here as well, but I think the number is pretty similar for oysters, as in I think that in the 90 something percent being raised through aquaculture. So this is something to think of as well, where these things are all coexisting together too, and really all tied together in a really positive way of encouraging people to come to Maine to enjoy Maine's bounty of seafood and really be able to offer a lot of different experiences that bring and keep people in Maine and eating good Maine seafood, whether that be wild or aquaculture. And it's pretty crazy to think about things like oysters too, and all these different aquaculture species, where oysters, for example, in aquaculture produce about as much value as clams do. And clams are iconic for Maine. They have been for, I mean, centuries, frankly. And it's a pretty similar value that oyster aquaculture creates. And it's only on a little bit of, only about 0.05% of Maine waters, not 5%, not 0.5, but 0.05% of Maine's waters in terms of tidal waters to be used for marine aquaculture. The equivalent of that is if you were to take one-pound lobster, the equivalent size, if that's Maine's territorial waters, the equivalent size of Maine aquaculture would be half of a grain of rice compared to a lobster. So maybe like the tiny, tiny, tiny tip of it, one antenna on a lobster is how much water is taken up by Maine aquaculture compared to that entire lobster that is Maine's territorial waters. That's all to say, it is a tiny, tiny fraction of the water that's producing a very significant amount of Maine's valuable seafood, especially when you look beyond lobster. So that's all to say, Maine aquaculture is the most valuable after lobster, led by salmon with other finfish and other iconic seafoods that are being grown here as well. So now the question is, who is growing the sector? So this is a second part of our study. So what I talked about before is all the work done through the in-plan model. And that really gives you the economic contribution. But this study, which is truly a picture of people out on the water working, is a look at who is growing the sector and how is it growing. This work was fascinating for me to do. And as far as I know, it's the first time it's really been captured as well, with some of it being captured in the previous study too. So one of the things to look at for us was how old are these businesses? What does the sector look like? What we found in this top figure is that this is a really young sector. As of 2014, I think it was about 82% of people had been in business for fewer than 10 years. That is an insanely young sector. And there's a pretty strong cohort in that 6 to 10 year that's moving through now a little bit as well. But by USDA definition, that means about 80% of the sector is beginning farmers. And not only does that show how new the sector is, but also shows the growth ahead. Because it's taking most of these people at least 5 to 10 years to reach their, frankly, a profitable level and to get to their steady state of operation. What we also found was not only is it the businesses, but the people working here are quite young too. So as we can see, the largest portion of workers are under 35. So this is a pretty young workforce. And for those of you who are on the water or see this, you probably are well aware of that. And this is something that we've seen change too. I can say when I was working in aquaculture 10 years ago, I was typically the only one in meetings under probably 50 something. And now there are people who are using language that I don't understand because they're that much younger than me. And that happens pretty frequently. And what we see on the water is very much indicative of that. A lot of people in their 20s, really, a lot in their 20s and some in their early 30s. And we do see people throughout the workforce as well, but the focus really is on people probably under 35 or so. And really, this is all with the room for growth too. And I want to highlight again how young this sector is and how much people are ready to grow. So when it comes to these farms, what do they really look like? Like who is driving this? What does the growth look like? You may see some of these numbers in here and think this must just be giant monolithic farms coming here to take over our waters. And as I mentioned, it's still only 0.05% of our waters, that little half grain of rice compared to a small 1 pound lobster. And what did we see? Well, we found that I think here the number is about 80 something percent of farms are under 20 acres. So what this is looking at is how many acres does each business hold? So this isn't just leases, this is businesses. And this also excludes LPAs. So for farms who hold leases, which is not currently all commercial farms, we see that about 80 something percent is looking at 82% is looking at under 20 acres. That's very small, especially when compared to farms. You know, if someone were farming 20 acres on land, you would probably ask them why they were doing that with their lawn or what their hobby was there. And of course, some people can make plenty good money on less than 20 acres on land too, depending on their business model too. But just really highlighting how small the sector is and how slowly it has been growing. Because if we include LPA only farms, which there aren't that many, that still means that then over probably about 90% of farms are under 20 acres. So what this is showing based on the previous slide and this one is that these are young beginning farms that are really small, with really most of them being, the majority of them being under 10 acres and the vast majority being under 20 acres. We also have the largest and least developed coastline in all of New England. And even still, we produce less than half the oysters of Massachusetts, or if you look to some of our neighbors in Canada as well, we produce a small fraction compared to what they do on much smaller coastlines often. So all to say, these are really young, small businesses, family driven, looking to grow at this very slow, sustainable rate they are. How do we know they want to grow? When we asked them how they have grown, they showed us that their median sales revenue growth was about 37.5%. But more importantly here, what we saw was that by 2030, across all subsectors, nearly everybody was expecting to stay either the same or grow. And the vast majority were looking to grow by a median of 75%. So that may sound crazy at first, but you may think of someone who is in a really early stage. Let's say they're only growing 10,000 oysters. If their goal is to grow by not that much to 100,000 oysters, that's going to really show a high revenue growth. And there are a lot of really early stage companies that are looking to grow from their first couple years when they're more finding their sweet spot in terms of their location, their growing methods, their markets, so on and so forth. They're looking to grow. Um, and we're seeing that with some more medium stage businesses too, who are getting closer to their right sweet spot of how the size they want their farm to be and making a consistent, sustainable profit. It's still really challenging to do for many types of farms in Maine. But what we saw through this work was that these businesses are hungry for growth and they need it. They need the growth in order to be at a stage at which they are profitable. And it shows that some of these young businesses are really just trying to reach the right size. Um, some of these things will occur in the current footprints. Some will require some additional space to survive just to break even. And that's one of the biggest challenges has been getting a lease in a quick enough fashion that they can, in those years where they're growing, but they're not yet at their sustainable, profitable level, that they can get to that level quick enough that they don't have to close down or really take some really risky business decisions to try to get that lease in a time at which they are able to then turn and maintain a sustainable profit. Because if not, some will be forced to close and let go of all their workers and so on and so forth. But what we do see is that this type of work is not only driving just the numbers, but this is driving growth and jobs in Maine's economy. The oyster tourism, for example, and aquaculture tourism at large, but especially through the Oyster Trail, I believe it's the second most visited website on Maine's Office of Tourism. As I mentioned from that other webinar, they're highlighting food as the number one reason people are coming to Maine. And iconic seafoods and foods in general, but iconic seafood, especially things like shellfish and other seafood species in Maine, are a big part of that driver of the tourism as well. So these are things we see reaching far beyond even the scope of the work we have here. And we see this especially in areas with more aquaculture activity. So think, for example, about how Daramusgata looked 20, 30 years ago versus what it looks like now. The vibrant number of, remember people working there even 15, 20 years ago saying that if they wanted to have a social life as an aquaculture farm employee, they had to drive to Portland or Boston. And now there are local aquaculture nights at the pubs for the young people who want to go out and meet and hang out with other people their own age. And that's before even getting to the tourism and the raw bars and things like that that are all popping up around the state. So another thing to wonder is where is this opportunity coming from and who is it really going to? Well, what we see is that the majority of the leaseholders are over 50 years in age. Most are in the 50 to 60s region, some a little higher than that, mostly 50s to 60s. And the workforce is really under 40 years old, especially under 35. And then this next part of this figure is showing that of this, 29% of leaseholders are identified as either female or non-binary, and amongst the workforce, about 24 identify as female or non-binary. You may be wondering what's a reference point for that? Well, that is 4 times the rate that is seen in commercial fishing nationwide. So what this really is, and this is the only data to our knowledge, and something that should be very much further explored in this area, because although this is still very much a male-dominated sector, seeing roughly a quarter of female or non-binary representation is showing that this is 4 times the rate seen in commercial fishing. And that's to say this is a lot of opportunity for other people and people who may have a lot of challenges getting into wild capture commercial fisheries due to licenses, stocks perhaps moving, so on and so forth. And what this really shows is that it is providing opportunity for a lot of different people to not only start their own business or launch their own career, but also it's a reason to stay in Maine. And Things like our apprenticeship program that we helped to start up and run really tell us that too. I was just talking with some people who were saying that they plan on leaving Maine, and through this apprenticeship program, they then got into aquaculture, and now it's their career for life. They never want to leave it and cannot think of another way for them to live and work. So it's something that we really see providing a lot of opportunity across the state. So, what are we going to do with this all now? Well, this is all out. This is live on our website. Here to take some questions in just a second. There's some infographics out there. Here's one, for example, on the screen that goes over a lot of the highlights I just mentioned. And really now, a lot of this is to get this out. So share this with policymakers like the legislature, DMR, DECD, NOAA, whatever the acronyms you would like. Give this to the people who look at the bigger picture here in the state of Maine and more broadly across the country. Figure out how we can help them understand what aquaculture does and how and why it should be supported in the state and broadly across the country. We also want to get out to local communities. For a lot of people, they see it happening on the water, but they don't know what it is. And this is a way to show them not only what impacts it's having in their local communities, but also who is doing this and where, what are they doing and how is that benefiting everyone on the local level. Last, also plan to publish a peer-reviewed article, so that's a bit more on the academic side. So that's working with some colleagues to, as I mentioned, take this first of its kind calculations and estimations done to get that into the more academic literature for others to use this type of work across the country to better estimate the growth we've seen here. And with that, I will turn it over to questions. And just to recap here, we're only seeing a moderate growth of about 5 to 6% per year across this study. Probably a little bit higher, especially based on some of the methodology differences between the 2014 study and ours. But what I really want to cover again is just thinking about where aquaculture fits in Maine. And it's really right up there. It's lobster and then it's aquaculture in Maine. We don't often think of that, and especially people who aren't familiar with aquaculture, if you were to say you're looking at this like it's the first time you ever heard about it, you probably wouldn't have known, you wouldn't have guessed this, or knowing what you may about seafood in Maine. But it fits in Maine's seafood, Maine's greater economy right after lobster. And what it offers people is for people of all ages, genders, so on and so forth, it offers opportunity for entrepreneurship. It offers opportunity for career growth. It offers an opportunity to meet people, to network, to have a reason to stay in Maine and love the work you're doing. And what we really want to look at here is ways to align work like our best management practices and other regulations to ensure the sustainable future for the sector, and really to focus on all the work we can, continuing to build aquaculture into the fabric of working waterfront communities and more.